And I'm just going to start with a little introduction. So today, Mr. David Himmelberger, president and founder of Health Outcomes Group, will be presenting on translation and linguistic validation of outcome measures. David Himmelberger has a master's degree in statistics from Purdue University. In 2010, he was recognized as the Distinguished Science Alumnus by Purdue University. After graduating from Purdue, he moved to Stanford University, where he was a biostatistician in the School of Medicine, Department of Family, Community, and Preventative Medicine, now the Department of Health Policy Research. While at Stanford, he worked on numerous projects at the medical school. At Stanford, he had a vision for focusing on the importance of quality of health as a primary outcome that would be used to approve new medical treatments and to guide patients and physicians in making decisions to select the best treatment option. David left Stanford in 1987 to found the Health Outcomes Group, a consultancy focused on measuring health outcomes, especially internationally. Health Outcomes Group provides services than just translation, linguistic validation of questionnaires. One such project was to define the performance characteristics of outcomes measures used to evaluate the effectiveness of the vaccine for herpes zoster. This work was critical in designing the clinical trial that was anticipated to require more than 40,000 patients to be enrolled. This work was done at the University of Pennsylvania and in California. David has traveled to more than 70 countries to train linguists to conduct interviews of patients. He was a part of the ISPOR task force that created the guidelines for translation of questionnaires used in cross-cultural research. David's interests continue in the areas of international research and patient-centered communications, identifying simple ways to collect health outcomes that are more universally applicable and in mechanisms associated with world-class athletic performance. If David doesn't provide his contact information in this presentation, we can certainly share it with those who are interested. So without further ado, go ahead, David.
Thanks very much, Erica. Good afternoon. I want to thank Christina Thielen and Dr. Mulcahy for the opportunity to talk to you today. We have worked together on the translation of the pediatric spinal cord injury measures from English into Spanish for use in the United States. Today, I will try to achieve three goals. Why is a special process used to translate and linguistically validate questionnaires? Secondly, to describe the current process that is in vogue. And three, to give you some ideas from the field of translation studies that suggest using a more flexible and pragmatic approach to translation of questionnaires. I want to begin by asking the question, why do we need special methods to translate questionnaires? I'm going to confine my remarks to the environment of conducting multinational clinical trials. Conducting such large multinational clinical trials is motivated by the desire to include representative data from small countries that are unable to fund adequately sized clinical trials. Consequently, the same clinical trial design is used in each country, and the data from a few patients from many countries are aggregated for a single statistical analysis. The data from these questionnaires are used by the FDA, EMA, the European Medicines Agency, and other international regulatory authorities to evaluate the efficacy and safety of new drugs. Not to bore you with a lot of statistics, but just very briefly, this notion of aggregating or pooling, as the statisticians refer to it, is based upon the premise that if we were measuring the same characteristic, such as the mean intensity of pain in small data sets, then the combined larger data set, the pool, will yield a more precise estimate of that characteristic. This underlying concept of sameness is the basis for the use of a global central laboratory in clinical trials. Most questionnaires designed to measure health outcomes have been created in one language, usually some version of English, such as the well-known SF-36. On the other hand, very few have been developed with an international focus from the outset. A notable example from a very short list is the HOOPBALL questionnaire. Another important point is that these questionnaires are written by professionals, often a psychologist or a physician for a lay audience. The frequent use of concepts and medical terms present many challenges. For example, the lay term arthritis could refer to either rheumatoid arthritis or osteoarthritis in English. The meaning in a questionnaire is derived from the context that guides the translator to choose the appropriate expression in the target language that has different lay terms for each disease. If you're working even in one country like India or in a multinational setting, the issues of language and culture are significant. A typical project that we work with is shown here on the slide. What is translation? One definition is converting one language, the source, to another language, the translation, so that the translation conveys the message intended in the source. So we see translation is a process through which the translator decodes the source language and encodes his or her understanding of it in the form of the translation in the target language. This is the directive. Our mission is to be true to the source, natural in the target language, with the restriction that you cannot make any changes to the source. This seems simple, but I will show you some of the challenges we encounter. There are many issues associated with the notion of what is translation. They have ranged from a very strict interpretation of translation, where elements of one language, the source, are replaced by equivalent elements in another language, the translation. In this case, the emphasis is on the source. A more dynamic notion of translation is where the meaning of the original source text in the translation language conveys the same message in the translation text and triggers the same impact on the translation audience as the source content did upon the source audience. Here, the emphasis is shifted to the translated text. Implied within these views of translation is the concept of equivalence. I will return to this in a few moments, but just a few words about the origins of the current process used to translate questionnaires. The current approach to developing questionnaires designed to measure health-related quality of life has arisen from two streams. Functional status measures arose in the medical literature and social indicators in the social science literature. There are many groups who have proposed a process for translating and validating these questionnaires. These approaches are largely variations on the same theme. However, the theoretical basis for the current process remains unclear. Due to time limitations, I won't try to review what these various methods are, but I will refer to the process outlined as mentioned in the introduction in the ISPOR guidelines of 2004, of which I was a member of that task force. All of the proposed guidelines had the following general framework in the process. The 6 steps on the left comprise the translation activities, and the 6 steps on the right comprise the validation activities. There are some minor variations in the composition of the groups that perform these functions, but the process generally follows this basic framework. What has been missing from this prescriptive approach is a theoretical foundation for it and a critical examination of how well it works. The current process has the central idea of equivalence. The concept of equivalence is widely discussed and debated in translation studies. The idea is that the source text and translated text should be the same in some sense. It is this idea of equivalence that is the basis for the pooling of the data from questionnaires in different languages. A basic definition is if a specific linguistic unit in one language carries the same intended meaning or message in another, then these units are considered to be equivalent. However, there's a problem with this formulation of equivalence. Anthony Pym, a noted Spanish linguist, noted the circularity of this view of equivalence, in which equivalence is supposed to define translation, and translation in turn defines equivalence. Another issue that remains fuzzy in the current equivalence-based theory used to translate questionnaires is the absence of criteria to assess the quality of the translation. The subjective application of back translation, evaluated by several reviewers, is not an objective criterion that can be used to assess equivalence and often leads a sponsor to have a false sense of security. The sequential hierarchical translation process that persists until today does not permit modifications of the source questionnaire, which reflect cultural differences and value differences of where the translations are to be used. So now I will turn to the current process and try to give you some ideas of how this might be modified. There are a lot of steps in here, as Christina knows, and it takes a good bit of time depending how many people are involved in the review process. Other than possible revisions, as shown at the bottom of this slide, you will notice the sequential flow of activities. The acceptance of this model rests upon the understanding of translation as the reproduction of the source language message in the receptor language. Translation is a form of interlingual communication where the message that the source text conveys to the source language reader is sent through the translated text to the target language audience. In this scheme, the general translatability between languages means any message can be adequately expressed by any language. The goal of this sequential strategy is to expand the scope of measurement of the original questionnaire into an international audience. A more fundamental assumption of this strategy is that the meaningfulness of the results obtained from the worldwide pooled data is comparable to those in the source version. As you see in the upper left, we begin with a planning, analysis, and kickoff phase before any translation begins. We review the source documents and identify ambiguities, inconsistencies, errors in grammar, spelling, cultural issues that may create problems during the translation process. These items are brought to the attention of the sponsor and the developer or developers if there's more than one questionnaire. The concept definition document should define the meanings the developer intends for concepts, objects, stimuli, and behaviors used in the questionnaire. It is helpful if the document contains examples, synonyms that are permitted, and terms that are not permitted for each concept. After discussion and resolution of all outstanding issues, the decisions are formalized in a written format in what we refer to as the translation guidelines. These guidelines are an attempt to improve equivalence by clarifying problems in the source. In the absence of written guidelines, the message intended in the source is likely to be interpreted in different ways by different translators. The translation guidelines include the concept definition and must be approved by the sponsor and the developer before any translation begins. At this time, we also begin the recruitment of patients to be interviewed during the linguistic validation phase. All of these points, including the extent to which the sponsor and developer are involved in reviewing and/or approving any translations, are discussed during a kickoff meeting. The roles and responsibilities and lines of communication are also specified. In the upper right, you see forward translation. This is where translation begins. This phase is referred to as forward translation because the input for the translation process, whose output consists of the source is the input for the translation process, whose output consists of multiple replications of the original. This marks the sequential dimension of this strategy. It's hierarchical in the sense that the original is treated as the unalterable matrix for generating copies. The current thinking is that two independent translations are better than one. This invariably leads to differences. These differences need to be resolved through a process referred to as reconciliation. The process of how to achieve a reconciled or consensus forward translation is open to some debate. Some do this through a committee that includes a third translator, or possibly a clinical investigator from the target country, or even a panel that involves representatives from the sponsor. The approach we utilize is that the translator who will conduct the interviews is the individual who reviews both forward translation and then creates the draft consensus forward translation. By noting those portions of the source content that have been difficult to translate and alternative ways to communicate the purpose of the source text, the translator is able to include these as items to be evaluated during the interviews with patients. The back translation stage, shown at the bottom, is where the fourth translator translates the reconciled translation in the target language into the source. This is referred to as a back translation because we are returning to where we started. Many people see back translation as the answer to the question, is this a good translation? If the back translation is the same as the source, then in the judgment of the reviewer, the translation is deemed to be good. Earlier, we noted the circularity in this line of reasoning. We have other problems as well. In most projects, there is more than one reviewer. There is the developer of the questionnaire, the sponsor who commissioned the translation, the sponsor's local affiliate who will oversee the clinical trial in the target country, the clinician and study coordinators who will administer the questionnaire at the study site, and the translators. The linguistic and cultural knowledge of these individuals varies greatly. In our experience, only rarely will a sponsor have a professional linguist be a reviewer. More often, the reviewer is a product manager or clinical research associate who is responsible for the product that is the subject of the clinical trial. This is also true for the sponsor's local affiliate. Clinicians and study coordinators have an in-depth knowledge of the target culture, but their knowledge of the source culture and language varies. The developer of the questionnaire is usually a monolingual speaker of English. Most developers believe that the back translation is the measure of what is a good translation. In the absence of a clearly defined review process, each reviewer has a different perspective. Another problem is that there are no criteria established to judge how a back translation is equivalent to the source. The perspective of the developer and sponsors based in an English-speaking country is that the translation must agree with the source. On the other hand, the perspective of the sponsor's local affiliate and that of investigators and study coordinators is the translation must be natural in the language and culture of their country. So as we can see, non-equivalence detected by the back translation is often a matter of perspective. Consequently, the role of the translator in these multinational projects is much more than that of a translator. Our translators must be diplomats who are skilled in mediation and who are able to settle disputes among the various stakeholders. Finally, the international harmonization step is to verify and implement any adjustments that are made in one language are also made in other languages. This step is also problematic since cultural and linguistic solutions are not universally applicable. In order to simulate the actual environment where the questionnaire will be completed during a clinical trial, the draft translation must be formatted and proofed. This may seem obvious, but because developers are unfamiliar with the fact that the translated content of most languages is 20 to 30% longer than the corresponding English source content, many problems arise. Formatting and proofing issues are not a trivial matter and can be very time-consuming, depending upon the software that the sponsor or developer uses. These issues present the translator with many challenges, especially when working with questionnaires that are implemented on an electronic device like a mobile phone. All of that is the first phase of translation. The second phase is the evaluation of the draft translated content with several individuals who are representative of the target audience for whom the translated questionnaire is intended. I prefer to refer to this as the linguistic validation phase rather than cognitive debriefing. Using my term, validation is a confirmation that the purpose of the sponsor has been effectively communicated to the target audience. Psychologists use the term debriefing in a specific way to mean a structured or semi-structured verbal conversation between the researcher and subjects in which an array of topics are addressed and discussed. However, when the average person hears the word debrief, the common understanding is to interrogate, usually used in the context of the military or police. An example is the hostages were later debriefed by the police. This is an example where the connotative meaning of debrief for some individuals has a very negative meaning associated with military occupation or being grilled by the police. This understanding is heightened among refugees and immigrants. An interview to answer questions about how well one understands the content of the questionnaire is non-threatening. Sponsors or developers who want to be involved in the review and approval process are encouraged to observe the linguistic validation. A few interviews are conducted with patients or subjects who are representative of the target audience. These interviews are usually face-to-face and conducted in a private setting. Depending upon the circumstance, a formal informed consent may be required. In all instances, the subject is informed about the interview in advance. The issue of confidentiality is of much greater significance when working internationally than it is within the United States. Our interviewers are professional linguists who have been specially trained to interview individuals with health problems, possibly serious problems that require hospitalization. Only a few translators have the requisite qualifications to be an interviewer. In addition to the recruitment of the appropriate subjects or patients with a range of backgrounds, preparation is crucial to having a successful interview. Unlike other groups, we target each interview so that it does not exceed 45 minutes. Patients are often very ill. They are apprehensive about disclosing personal information with a stranger, and some individuals are not accustomed to answering structured questionnaires in a format that may be unfamiliar. To prepare for the interviews, we create an evaluation form to retain written documentation of our findings as we capture them. The interviewers focus on the primary endpoints of the study, and each interview also analyzes how well the subject understands the vocabulary, the clarity of the questions, and if the subject can follow the instructions correctly. The scales are also of critical importance. We have developed special techniques to evaluate the degree to which subjects perceive the scalar properties of the translated scales and the extent to which they are similar to perceptions of subjects using the same scales in the source language. When the interviewer believes that all questions that arose during the translation process have been resolved and also has sufficient confidence that the purpose of the translated questionnaire has been effectively communicated to individuals that are representative of the target audience, the interviews are concluded. The interviewer then summarizes the findings from the interviews in a brief written synopsis. If the linguist who conducted the interviews determines that changes are required to the translated content, the problem is described, the rationale for the changes noted, and the recommended solution, along with the back translation, is provided. These recommendations are forwarded to the project manager, who is responsible for determining whether the recommendations are accepted. This step is necessary in order to be sure that all changes conform to the translation guidelines and to be sure that the purpose of the translation is met. Finally, the changes are made in the formatted questionnaire and proofed. Depending upon the project, some translations require review and approval by the developer and/or sponsor before they are finalized. So that's the process. I thought it would be informative to take an example or two. The double standard of equivalence and naturalness often puts the translator in a predicament. I'd like to illustrate this with an example from the SF-36. As you see on the screen, question 9 with item H, how much of the time during the last 4 weeks have you been a happy person? The basic structure of how much of the time for the 9 items shown here seems natural and easy for an English speaker to answer questions about how one has been feeling during the past 4 weeks. So what I'd like to do is give you some insight of whether the translation of this question can meet our double standard of equivalence and naturalness. So let's look a little deeper. You may not be aware of this, but many people around the world perceive Americans as always smiling with a disingenuous facade. You're probably asking, what does this have to do with translation? I noted the dilemma of the translator when faced with the challenge of finding a translation that is true to the source and natural in the target language. The meaning of happiness is not uniform across cultures. Aristotle said, happiness is the meaning and purpose of life, the whole aim and end of human existence. From the psychologist's perspective, a happy person is characterized as someone who has pleasant feelings most of the time and feels satisfied with his or her life overall. For the Japanese, happiness is more about social harmony. For most Americans, happiness is an unalienable right and is commonly associated with positive experiences as well as personal achievements. While the right to the pursuit of happiness is not stated in the Constitution, it is included in the Declaration of Independence. It may surprise you that only 3 states explicitly recognize the right to happiness in their constitutions. In 1923, the Supreme Court recognized pursuing happiness as a right at the national level in a case about teaching a foreign language in Nebraska. Germans do not enjoy such legal support. Given the German history and duty-bound code of social virtues, happiness takes on a different meaning, especially among the older generation. For many in Germany, happiness describes a state of contentment and satisfaction. In other words, being satisfied with one's place in life. In German, this is Zufrieden. When we ask the question, how much of the time have you been a happy person during the past 4 weeks to people outside of the English-speaking world, I receive puzzled looks of suspicion. A typical response is, am I supposed to be happy? Yes, there are times when I feel happy, but I would not say that I'm a happy person. There's both a linguistic and cultural basis for this response. If we examine the etymology of the word for happy in most languages, we find it comes from the word for lucky. This is to be distinguished from happiness, which is mostly explained and understood in connection with a state of salvation or a high degree of complacency. In other words, to be satisfied. For this seemingly simple question, there is more that a translator must consider when translating the question. There are semantic issues and how individuals in non-English cultures formulate a question about these types of events. The basic event and the question, how much of the time were you a happy person, is natural for English speakers, but is not natural and is incorrectly formulated for individuals in most other languages. For non-English speakers, when evaluating a sensation like feeling tired, the response domain should be a frequency, not a duration, as shown at the bottom of this slide. This also necessitates changing the question from how much of the time to how often. An attempt to make this work in German is shown here. For this audience, I've shown you the corresponding English for the more natural question in German, wie oft waren Sie glücklich, that uses the literal translation of happy into German. You will notice that happy in English is an adjective, but in German it is a noun. Now, if we were to think in German, a functionally equivalent question that is natural for a German would be, how satisfied were you with your life during the past 4 weeks? However, we notice that the outcome domain now is a measure of intensity. Interestingly, this last formulation will also work in English. Another issue is that the English source version of the SF-36 is open to interpretation. Does the phrase, how much of the time during the past 4 weeks, mean that the respondent should mentally compute an average of the past 4 weeks? Or should the respondent accumulate all of his or her experiences into a total amount of time? Both interpretations are possible. If you recall, our original formulation of the translation task was to produce multiple copies of the original source in the target language. For those of you who speak German and Italian, here are the official translations of the questions about happiness in the SF-36. In case you're not speaking German and English, here are the back translations for those 2 questions. If we use the standard test of equivalence and look at the English back translations, you can ask yourself, are these equivalent to the English source? Your answer probably depends upon your perspective. Which language do you speak? German, Italian, or English? And how well do you know these cultures? I've also shown the English back translations of the 6 category labels for the answers. While the answers for the English source are relative proportions of time, the official translations in some of the other languages mix frequency and duration for both question and responses. Often overlooked is the final translation of the results. By this, I mean the interpretation of the results and conclusions drawn from the statistical analysis of the data that arises from the translated questionnaires. This translation of the meaning of the results can have implications for how clinicians manage their patients and how politicians create policy. If you use the SF-36 to evaluate whether your treatment has improved happiness or positive affect, did you improve the amount of time people are in this state? Or did you improve how often they had this feeling? Does it even matter? Consider the case where you're evaluating an outcome that occurs infrequently, but is of long duration, or conversely, an outcome that occurs frequently that is of short duration. Depending upon which scale you use, a respondent's answers are at opposite ends of the scale. Yes, it does matter. Given the constraints, we ask if this process has achieved our goals of naturalness and equivalence. Is it possible to achieve the objective of equivalence? Or an even more basic question, is this the correct goal that should be the objective of translation? What I'd like to do now is turn to give you a few ideas from the perspective of translation studies. Although there's been much debate about equivalence, the notion that seems relevant for us in the context of translating a questionnaire is pragmatic equivalence. Pragmatic equivalence deals mainly with implicature. Paul Grice and later Mona Baker argued that the term implicature is used to refer to what is implied and not to literal meaning. In other words, the focus of interest is not on what is explicitly written, but what is intended or implied in a given context. The role of the translator is to work out the meaning of what is implied in the source and transfer this to the extent that this is possible in the translated text. The primary aim of the translator should be to recreate the intended message of the source language in such a way that it becomes accessible and comprehensible to the target audience. The work of Hans Vermeer and Justa Holtz-Manfari redirected the focus from linguistic-based approaches to a more functionally and culturally oriented concept of translation. In Vermeer's scopus theory, scopus, which is Greek for purpose, the translator is guided by the purpose of the source text, and the role of the translator is to communicate this purpose in the translated text. In this theory, known as scopus theory or functionalism, it is the receiver who is reading the translated text who decides how his or her understanding of the text functions in his or her culture. This next sentence is long, but it's important. In contrast to equivalence-based translation theory, the main point of the functionalist approaches is that it is not the source text recipient or the effects of the source text on the recipient or the function the author assigns to the source text that determines the translation process and the linguistic makeup of the target text, but rather it is the prospective function or purpose of the target text as determined by the sponsor's needs that guides the translation process. Within this functionalist approach, translation is viewed as a communicative action carried out by an expert in intercultural communication, the translator, aiming at some communicative purpose. Vermeer derives a general scopus rule which states, translate, interpret, speak, write in a way that enables your text translation to function in a situation in which it is used and with the people who want to use it and precisely in the way they want it to function. The framework for a functional approach would therefore allow any transfer procedure which leads to a functional target text. The question then arises, who determines the scopus? According to Vermeer, the scopus is defined by the sponsor and, if necessary, adjusted by the translator. Christine Nord added that the scopus should be embedded in the translation brief, which means the person initiating the translation decides what the scopus is. Nord called this the functionality principle. Experience shows there's always more than one method or strategy of translation of one particular source text. Therefore, translation is a decision process which must be guided by some kind of subjective criterion or set of criteria. Scopus theory suggests that this criterion should be the communicative function or functions for which the target text is needed. The translator must take into account the differing expectations of the partners, anticipate misunderstandings, and find a way to avoid conflicts. The responsibility that translators have to their partners is what Nord refers to as loyalty. Since the notion of what is a good translation varies substantially, Nord argued that translators in their role as mediators between two cultures have a special responsibility to all of their partners, specifically the author of the text in the source, the client or sponsor of the translation, and the receiver reading the target text, as well as to themselves. She stresses that adaptations often are the only way to ensure that translation works in the target culture situation for which it is produced. As Nord noted, when you begin by the functional analysis of the source text in its own source situation and contrast that with the target situation as described in the translation assignment, translation problems can be detected in advance. This procedure makes it easier for the translator to develop translation strategies for the solution of a particular translation problem, which are designed for the translation of whole text and not for individual units, such as words or phrases. As shown on this slide, the first step for a particular translation problem, for example, a cultural problem, as in, are you able to reach and get down a 5-pound object, such as a bag of sugar, from just above your head, is analyzed with regard to its function in the text and in the target situation. 2, the analysis leads to a decision whether the translation has to be adapted to target culture norms and conventions, or whether it should reproduce the source culture conventions in the source text. 3, this decision sets limits on the range of linguistic means to be used. 4, the translator chooses which ones fit into the specific context, such as text type, register, style, etc. And 5, if there's still a choice between various means, the translator may decide according to individual stylistic preferences. If we apply the functionalism strategy to our example, this process for translation reveals the problems are with units of measurement, pounds versus kilograms, and packaging issues, where sugar is usually packed in 1 kilogram bags in countries outside of the US. So what is the metric equivalent of a 5-pound bag of sugar? The purpose of the original question was to evaluate the difficulty individuals have in reaching and lifting a heavy object. This is particularly relevant for individuals with conditions like rheumatoid arthritis or other joint and muscle problems of the hands. It is not that the object has to be a bag of sugar or that the object must weigh exactly 5 pounds. A 1 or 2 liter can of olive oil would serve the equivalent purpose in countries like Italy, Spain, Greece, while a 2 kilogram bag of flour would work in other countries. This last example highlights 2 important ideas missing from the current translation process. The first is that the statement of the purpose of the translation is missing. And second, that there is no opportunity for the translation process itself to provide valuable feedback that informs the developer and sponsors of inadequacies in existing questionnaires. If all translators understand the purpose of the question, the second example of a 5-pound bag of sugar is easily solved by adaptation. The first example of how much of the time were you a happy person illustrates a more fundamental issue that is not solved by any form of adaptation. The perspective that arises from functionalism is in conflict with the current equivalence process that is generally used to translate a questionnaire for use in cross-cultural settings. So finally, I'd like to conclude with a few ideas and suggestions. Rather than requiring translators to adhere to a rigid approach to translation of questionnaires, we could consider some of these observations. Number 1, explicitly state the purpose of the translation before any translation begins. The purpose should clarify the requirements that must be met in order to allow the data from different language versions of questionnaires to be pooled for a single statistical analysis. The translation should also be loyal to the purpose for all partners, specifically the author of the source text, the client or sponsor of the translation, the receiver reading the target text, as well as to the translator. Secondly, consider using a more functionalist top-down translation process, realizing that the meaning of the content is continually changing. Not all concepts are universal, and even if a concept exists, it may not have the same meaning in all cultures. Also, that the grammar and structure of the language have an important effect in influencing meaning. And third, adopt a more pragmatic notion of translation as a communicative process, where meaning, ideas, and values must be allowed to reflect the culture of the target country without imposing artificial equivalents. The translation should have meaning for the receiver in the target culture and retain the loyalty to the intended function of the source. Ensure that all reviewers understand the purpose of the translation and that they are knowledgeable of both the source and target language and culture. No matter what you try to do, all respondents reading a questionnaire will operationalize the meaning of the text according to the current situation in his or her culture. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was a really informational presentation. I know we only have a few minutes here, so I just wanted to open up the floor for any questions or discussion in the last about 7 minutes of our meeting time. So if you have anything, please feel free to unmute and.
Hi, can you hear me, Erica?
Yes.
Hi, I would like to ask a question. Is that okay?
Of course.
All right, great. Thank you so much. This was a wonderful talk. I'm Namrita Gram-Purohit. I'm here at the Center for Outcomes and Measurement. So one of the questions I have is regarding proposals and reviews that I have done, typically from medical schools, where physicians state that if they encounter participants who speak a different language, that they will invite translators to join during the sessions, be it consenting or any other data collection sessions. What do you tell investigators who put that blanket statement in their protocols, and what would be the best approach in that situation?
I think the answer to that depends upon the institution. What we have observed is that oftentimes the only informed consents that are available to patients are in English. And that makes it exceedingly difficult for them and may lead in often cases to not even participating in the study or looking for other forms of treatment. What we would recommend is that the actual informed consent be an abbreviated form in the language of the patient. Now, some institutions are open to that, others are not, because there's a big concern about legal ramifications. But in all cases, if you are using an interpreter, what we would suggest is having some sort of a written script that is approved by the legal department when explaining issues and particularly risk of whatever treatment it is.
That's a good idea. I like the idea of the script. Thank you.
That typically will assuage part of the fears of the institution and lawyers.
That's great. Thank you.
Any other questions?
That was very informative, and I really appreciated the examples that you gave about the word happy. It's not something I would have ever thought about before. I am one of MJ's research coordinators, and we're doing a performance-based outcome measure. So as part of that, we have verbal instructions that we give the participant, but then we also use a video demonstration to help them understand what we're asking for. And I'm just wondering, as we're moving forward with developing these items, if the video demonstration might be sufficient to help with any issues with translation, or if there's any sort of things we can keep in mind as we're writing out our instructions.
Well, we have a bit of experience with that right now, particularly with a collaborative project we're doing in Australia. Australia has 280 languages that are spoken across the continent there. And one of the issues that's come up about vaccination is, how do you get the message out to these groups? And so videos are being produced, and we're using actual subjects who are representative of the cultures and languages spoken. So far, there's Chinese, Vietnamese, Italian, and something else. But one of the things that we've recognized, that most of the reticence is because of a very strong feeling of distrust among these culturally diverse and linguistic minorities. And so the issue for the translation of those videos, the content of it, we found that we have to have a very neutral tone, trying to be as informative and appearing as unbiased as possible, because it's really a matter of trust building for these people. They see mixed messages, even as we've seen in our country. Officials and politicians do one thing, and then they tell the general public to do something else, or the message comes out at one point in time one way, and a little bit later it's something else. But there we did some market research in advance of producing those videos, trying to find out which groups were most represented, and then secondly, to find out what are the mediums by which they get their information. And so that was also critical in deciding how, once we produced something in another language, how it was distributed to those individuals.
I know we are running out of time. David, would you mind if we gave your email to anybody who had a question that we didn't get to towards the end of this?
No, that's fine. And if anybody wants a copy of the slides or even the entire talk, they can contact me directly, and that's all available.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you to everyone who was able to make it. And again, thank you, David, for your wonderful presentation. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for your
You're welcome.
time.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.
You too.